of traditions about Alexander that were circulating since the Hellenistic period and in late antiquity. Now, at some point, probably, there is much debate about that, but probably around the 3rd or the 4th century CE, some of these legends were gathered together in a work, Greek work known as the Alexander Romance. Okay, so the Alexander Romance and the Nesana are two completely different works. Okay, the Alexander Romance became more like a cycle of legends, and it was a work that was expanded, translated several times. If I'm not wrong, I think that up to the point of the translation of the Bible in modern language, the Alexander Romance was the work most translated in the Middle Ages. So we have,
and, you know, I just to stop there, I found something very recently, or not recently, but I had read that they had found a Al-Hamiado version of Pseudo Callisthenes in Spain from the 19th century. So that just kind of shows how widespread this literature was to make it all the way to Spain, with crypto Muslims hiding it in their house from the Inquisition.
Yeah, it's a very complex history of transmission, because we have different recensions of the Greek Romance, and we have as many translations of these Romans. We have Armenian translations, we have Syriac translations, then we have Persian, Farsi versions, not translations. So it's very complicated. And of course, we also have Arabic versions that have been recently rediscovered. They were thought to be lost, but some versions of the Alexander Romance in Arabic have recently been found. Now, it's extremely important to separate the Alexander Romance of the so-called Pseudo-Callisthenes from the Syriac Nesana. So it is true that we have a Syriac version of the Alexander Romance. It is not completely clear when it was composed, whether in the 6th or the 7th century, if it was translated from Greek, or if it was translated from Middle Persian, Pahlavi version. So there is a lot of debate about that. The Nesana ad Alexandros occurs, is found in the manuscript tradition, is transmitted as some kind of appendix to the Syriac Alexander Romance, but they are two works completely different. The author of the Nesana might have been familiar with some of the traditions that belong to the literary universe of the Alexander Romance. But it's important to distinguish between the sources. It's a very common mistake to think that the episode of Alexander's Gate in the Nesana comes from the Alexander Romance. It is rather the other way around. But this is this is maybe something behind the scope of this conversation we're having. What I wanted to emphasize is the distinction between these two works.
Okay, so the Romance of Alexander, the Syriac legend of Alexander, two completely separate works. They're not basically one and the same, where one is a Syriac translation and the others are translations into other languages, but the contents itself is different, with, as you kind of touched on but didn't want to go too much into, that maybe the later romances might have taken aspects from the Syriac version of it. Okay, so
the Syriac Nesana, the author of the Syriac Nesana might have taken some traditions that also occurred in an early version of the Alexander Romance. So it's a very complicated narratological network of traditions. So, and sometimes it's not always easy to untangle these connections.
Okay, so what is the historical context by which the Nishana was created? Basically, what were the social, political, cultural, or economic situations that may have influenced its composition?
Okay, so let's say that first of all, we have to understand that although the Nishana tells a story about Alexander, this is not the historical Alexander, in so much as the Alexander of the Alexander Romans is not really the historical Alexander. This we are more in the framework of narratology, of stories, so that are not really connected to history. They are inspired too, but it's more like legends. Okay, so that does not mean that the author of the Nesana doesn't care about history. It's just that he's not interested in the history of the historical Alexander. Is interested in the history in his own historical context. So there is a many scholars recently have accepted a theory, and I include myself before starting writing my book among these scholars who embrace this theory, according to which the Nesana was composed in the 30s of the 7th century to address the political circumstances of the war between Byzantium and the Sasanian Empire, and in the end with the aim of celebrating Emperor Heraclius. This is a theory that gained many consensus over the past decades and became very influential. And I was also a partisan of this theory, if you want. Then recently I had to reconsider my own position, and this I am now offering an alternative view, which is not completely new. It had already been offered by earlier scholars, according to which the Nesana was composed several decades earlier than what many scholars maintain. And the historical context is that of the reign of Justinian. So we are in the middle of the 6th century. And it was composed to address a previous conflict. It was the conflict that opposed Justinian to the Persian king Khosrow Anushirvan. And the author of the Nesana uses the figure of Alexander with a very specific political agenda. It is basically reshaping some kind of political trend in Roman policy. It's the phenomenon of this so-called imitatio Alexandri that had been cherished and pushed by some Roman emperors with the intent of implying that a new Alexander will come to destroy Persia once more. But what is really peculiar to the Nesana is the way in which these previous trends are refined in a very peculiar way. Above all, we must say that Alexander here appears as a Christian prophet. And this is the first time that we witness this metamorphosis of Alexander, who is portrayed as a pious king who receives the revelations by the Christian God, and who vows to settle his throne in Jerusalem to welcome the arrival of the Messiah. And there is this apocalyptic ideology that is found in this text, It's some kind of re-elaboration of ideas that were already been propagated by another Syriac author, Afrahat, back in the 4th century. And the idea is that the Christianized Roman Empire towards the end of times will defeat Persia once more, and it will establish a cosmocracy to welcome the arrival of the Messiah. And on the background of this ideology, there are biblical prophecies, especially the Danielic prophecies in Daniel. Now, in this ideological framework and historical framework, there are two more things to be said that are relevant, very relevant for our conversation today to understand the origin of the Zulkarnain pericope. First of all, the author, to pursue his political and ideological agenda, uses previous traditions about Alexander, including the one about the iron gates that Alexander had allegedly built in the Caucasus, in an area around modern Georgia, I would say. So these traditions are well certified since at least the time of Josephus, so we are in the 1st century BCE. Of course, the historical Alexander probably never constructed any iron gates and probably never reached to that area.
But that's what I read from Andrew Anderson Rooney has a really good paper on that subject, talking about the historical Alexander versus the Alexander of Romance tradition.
Yeah, that's a classical study. It's a bit outdated, but it's still one of the most, the best investigated. So
yeah, it's dawning on 100 years old, I believe. It came out in 1928 or 1932 or something like that. But that was my first introduction to comparing the historical Alexander to the one in the Romance, because I know that's where some people kind of get things mixed up. Like, okay, how could Zulkarnain be Alexander when Zulkarnain in the Quran is very different than the Alexander of history? But a lot of people, they don't take into account that, okay, the Quran might not be making a play on the Alexander of history, but the Alexander of a literary genre. So
absolutely. And we are, you know, also with these legends, we can be almost sure that Alexander never reached to that area, but this is not really relevant for us. What is relevant is that people believed that Alexander had arrived there and that he had established iron gates to block nomads from the other side of the Caucasus, okay? So these traditions are well certified. Jerome in the 4th century refers to this tradition. And in the 6th century, we have authors like Byzantine authors like Procopius and Jordanes who refer to these iron gates established by Alexander. So we are in the very same context of the Syriac author of the Nesana. What is new in the Nesana is the way in which this story is used. First of all, the reason, the purpose of using this legend about Alexander. As I mentioned, it might be true that Alexander didn't establish any gate, but historically we know that in those Caucasian passes, mountain passes, there were actual fortifications that were identified with those of Alexander's in the legend. And these are the famous so-called Caspian gates. Now, these Caspian gates, by the time our author was writing, had become a bone of contention between the Byzantines and the Persians, because apparently the Persians had managed to extend their control to those fortifications, and they demanded the Romans to give them money for the defense of these passes. And if you read 6th century sources, you will find an incredible amount of reference to these Caspian Gates, because it was a very thorny political issue. The Persians went as far as using it as a casus belli. The Romans refused to pay this money that the Persians were asking, and then the Persians would use it as a reason to start a war, okay? And of course, there were several implications. The Romans didn't want to pay money because this might look like being subjugated to the payment of a tribute, and so it was a very thorny political situation issue. The Syriac author of the Nesana resumes this legend about Alexander, and what he wants to say is our ancestor, because in his ideology, Alexander is the mythical founder of the Greco-Roman Empire, established these gates. So he wants to claim for the Roman Empire the role that the Persians are claiming for themselves. But it's not the only thing. He uses this motif in an incredible way. He's extremely skilled, and he does a literary operation that he constantly does in his work. He takes traditions from the classical Greco-Roman literature with which he's ostensibly familiar, and he reads these traditions at the light of biblical exegesis. So the gate that Alexander allegedly built to confine these nomads from Central Asia becomes an eschatological portal. Why? Because following a trend in exegesis, he identifies the Huns on the other side of the Caucasus with the apocalyptic nations of Gog and Magog. Okay, so this is a crucial point. This is the first time that we have a source in which the gate built by Alexander has an eschatological function. In previous references to the motif of Alexander's gate, there is no such a thing. And one thing that I was able to notice while doing my research for my book is that there is a very, if you want, a small innovation, but which is extremely significant. All previous sources refer to iron gates. In the Nesana, for the first time, we read that the gate edified by Alexander is made out of iron and bronze. And there is a very specific reason why the author introduces this new element, and this is the symbolism that you find in the Book of Daniel. According to the Syriac author, the empire of Alexander is some kind of blending, a mix, if you want, of the third and the fourth empires of world history, which in Daniel are represented by iron and bronze, respectively. So the gate forged by Alexander represents the role that this Greco-Roman Empire founded by Alexander play in sacred history. And so this is a very important thing because we have two significant developments. We have the gate that becomes a gate against Gog and Magog, and then we have a gate, an iron gate that becomes a gate of iron and bronze. Okay, so, and this is one first relevant element. A second relevant element is that of Alexander's horns. Okay, in the Syriac legend, we read that Alexander receives horns from God to gore, literally to pierce the other world kingdoms. Okay, now we are here facing the exact same literary operation made by the author on the motif of Alexander's gate. References to the horns of Alexander are very well known. Okay, Alexander was represented with a ram horns of the Greek-Egyptian god Zeus Ammon. Okay.
And was this in his time that he was represented with two horns? Because I've heard debates about, Alexander being represented with two horns is a 7th century invention by Heraclius in order to kind of promote and propagate a certain view. But basically that the horns on Alexander is a later invention, or was it a contemporary to his time or happened shortly after?
Well, first of all, no, it's not the first. We have the first representations of Alexander's horns on coins minted in the, I think for the first time in either Egypt or Thracia, but we are in the reigns of that followed the disgregation of Alexander's kingdom. So it's a very ancient symbolism applied to Alexander, and if we want to believe the witness of some Greek author, Alexander himself would wear horns to appear like the hair of Zeus Ammon. But again, what is relevant is that these representations were for sure known during late antiquity. Okay. And our Syriac author was familiar with this kind of representations, but once again, he uses these traditions, visual or literary traditions, but he reads them at the light of biblical exegesis. In the Syriac work, there are at least 3 references to biblical passages. The most important of which is a reference to the prophecy, the image of the ram and the he-goat in Daniel 8. And the Syriac author performs a very interesting hermeneutic operation in identifying Alexander not with the he-goat, but with the ram. Anyway, it's a very complex topic. I don't think we will have time to exploit it entirely, but the important thing is that again we are facing a very precise literary operation. There is an element taken derived from the classical tradition and read the light of biblical exegesis to address contemporary political issues, because also the way in which the author interprets the symbolism of Alexander's horns has an anti-Persian agenda. So if you want, everything comes together. Alexander has horns because he's a prophet and charged by God and tasked by God to defeat Persia. And since he is tasked by God, is also the one who builds the wall, the gate against the Gog and Magog. But last thing, then I will stop because I'm talking a lot.
Okay.
This is the first source in which we find together the motif of a horned Alexander and that of the wall built against Gog and Magog. And we have if you want, pivotal elements that are really important to understand our Quranic pericope on the Qarnayn.
All right, so given the historical context behind the composition of the Syriac legend of Alexander, it's safe to say that the production of this work was well received in its time, given all the things that were happening, Heraclius' defeat of the Persians, and stuff like that. So it was a very popular work. It wasn't like it went unnoticed. It wasn't something that maybe someone found later on and it became popular then, but from its conception, it was something that kind of just took off in the minds of people, or late antiquity.
Well, So I really don't want to overstate its importance, because it might sound like that I'm trying to promote the text that I have been investigating during the past almost, I think, 15 years. I think that's, or I've been studying this text for at least 12 years. But so there is always the risk to become a bit obsessive and to really overestimate the actual impact. But I am confident to say that it had a reception. And in fact, it's kind of ironic to see that even if it went mostly unnoticed in modern scholarship, in its historical context, it received a considerable amount of attention, because if we wanted to make just a very quick calculation of the text that are under the influence of this Nesana, we have then this 6th century Nesana. Then we have an updated version, because the Nesana was adapted to the time, to the context and the time, historical context of the reign of Heraclius. There is, it's not a huge literary operation, it's just the interpolation of a sentence and maybe the removal of an episode. But this shows at least that the work was received, and somebody living at the time of Heraclius, while reading the story of Alexander and the Nesana, said, wow, listen, this is happening now. And so it was interpreted as some kind of foretelling, not the period of Justinian, but the period of Heraclius. So we have two Nesana. Then we have a metrical homily, Syriac, which is ascribed to Jacob of Serug, a 6th century Syriac poet, but that was probably composed later. Now, also in this case, many scholars believe that this Syriac homily was written during the reign of Heraclius, and I disagree with this. I think that I have reason to believe that the homily was composed somewhere around the end of the 6th century. So we have already 3 texts, and we have an updated version of this homily.
At the 635 version?
Yes,
the updated,
exactly.
okay.
So, and this is just the first layer of text that are under the influence of the Nesana. Then we have another Syriac poem attributed to Ephraim, the so-called pseudo-Ephraim's homily. And then we have the Apocalypse of the Pseudo-Methodius,
which I found to be very interesting. I didn't have a chance to look into the contents, but just from what I understood of its content, it kind of does what the Syriac legend of Alexander does with the Justinian version, but kind of adapts it to its period of time. So instead of the Central Asians being Gog and Magog, the Arab invaders are Gog and Magog, if I understood it correctly.
Well, so first of all, this is a very typical phenomenon in apocalyptic text. Prophecies are re-updated to address new circumstances, historical circumstances. That's why it's very often it's so tricky to date them, because there is a textual stratification, different textual layers. In the case of this Nesana, it was used to address, first of all, it was understood as addressing new circumstances, okay? And then it was used by other authors to address other circumstances.
Yep.
Pseudo-Ephraim uses the story of Alexander Gate as mostly as an element of periodization of the eschatological time. So when the gate will be removed, this apocalyptic process will start. But what is interesting in the Pseudo-Ephraim now is that the apocalyptic process also includes the arrival of the sons of Ishmael, okay? And we have the same in the Pseudo-Methodius. Another thing, another point of interest in the Nesana for these authors was the idea that no matter what difficulties in the actual reality, the Roman Empire, the Christian Roman Empire, will survive, and in the end it will conquer the world. So this is an element of interest in the Nesana for these authors who were witnessing these new events. The empire was suffering, and this was some kind of reactions.
You know, all this talk about the Nishana, I think maybe we should start getting into the contents of it, just for people so they know exactly what is being said in the work. So how is the contents of the Nishana structured? In your article, you have it broken down in like 3 parts, but is that just how you kind of did it for your academic work, or is that actually kind of how it's separated into 3 parts?
Okay, good question. So first of all, that article is a bit outdated. I mean, I still think, I still agree with myself of 8 years ago, I would say, with some changes of mind. But anyway, I'm still, it's still a project for the future to write a new article or even essay or short monograph on the topic.
Still gets a lot of publicity, being one of the few articles on the subject.
Yeah, it was very surprising because it was published on not very well-known journal. And according to statistics on my academia.edu website, is the article that received most attention. So it was quite surprising. So in that article, I had divided the narrative into 3 sections, mostly to distinguish among the different traditions that the author used. So we have the first section in which we read Alexander declaring his intention to explore the world and to conquer other kingdoms. He summons the nobles of his kingdom, gathering information about how the edges of the world are structured. Then we have a prayer of Alexander to God, in which Alexander vows to submit the world to welcome the Messiah. And then we read about the Alexander's travels at the edges of the world. This is a very fascinating section because we read a lot of cosmology, a lot about how people imagine the world to look like.
And you have I will plug this in the description. Unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to read it. The title is a bit, you know, maybe the title could have been a bit more clickbaity, but I didn't know it was actually talking about the very subject we're talking about now. I did see the cosmology, Quran, chapter 18, 60 to 65, but for some reason I didn't plug it into the interview or I didn't kind of connect it to the interview that I'm doing today.
Well, it's I would say the topic is connected. It's not exactly about the Nesana, but it's also related. But anyway, this first section of the Nesana is fascinating, especially because it contains some kind of reminiscences of very ancient legends, especially about Gilgamesh. There is this hypothesis that at some point the story of Gilgamesh had been used to formulate stories about Alexander, and there are some kind of interesting reminiscences in the Nesana. Now, from this set of traditions that find parallels in several sources, the Greek Alexander Romance, the Babylonian Talmud, and a bunch of Latin authors. We pass to another set of traditions. And the passage is very clear. It's like as if Alexander abandoned the world of fantasy in which he witnesses the sun entering a window in the heaven, and in which he reaches poisonous waters, and then he arrives to a very specific and recognizable geographical area, which is that of the Caucasus. We are in the areas of the so-called Dariali Pass, and in the area of Roman Armenia. And from now on, the only traditions our author refers to are mostly those that were believed to be more historical, like the one about Alexander's gift.
Okay.
And then we have a section about this conflict between Alexander and the Persians. Of course, stories about the war of Alexander against Darius were very well known, but this war seen in the Nessana is very peculiar. It's really a scene where it's one of the first wars.
I think you froze a bit.
Oh,
you just froze for about 2 seconds.
Okay, I'm back. So I was saying that the scene of this battle in the Nessana between Alexander and the Persians is very unusual. Mm-hmm. Because, of course, the sacralization of warfare and the militarization of religion is a phenomenon that had already been going on from at least the Christianization of the early Christianization of the Roman Empire. But I'm not aware of other sources of the time in which you can literally read of God going to battle with a Christian army. And it's very interesting because this is not something very usual in Syriac literature, but you find some strong parallels in Armenian sources. So, and the fact that if you want, the geopolitical interests of the author pivot around the region of Roman Armenia and the Caucasus might be telling us something about the author's origins.
And, I mean, as you already mentioned, a lot of the stories in the Nishana are a retrojection of contemporary events. As you know, as you mentioned, Gog and Magog is dealing with, or I don't know, did you mention that Gog and Magog, the invasion, actually is dealing with what had happened in periods, in times previous to the construction of, or the composition of the Nishana, because I read that there was a Central Asian invasion prior to the production of the Nishana. And that's actually what the Nishana is kind of touching on, saying that it happened, kind of demonstrating that it happened before, or using that incident to show that it's a possibility that this could happen in the future.
Well, it's a very interesting question. First of all, the nomadic population from Central Asia by that time had been identified with the biblical Gog and Magog. Okay, we don't have any source claiming that Alexander built a gate to confine the biblical Gog and Magog, and I have, as I mentioned in my monograph, I have a reason to think that this operation was made by the author of the Nessana himself. Now, the author acknowledges that these Huns, among whose kings Gog and Magog are listed, So Gog and Magog in the Nesana are kings of the Huns. The author acknowledges that invasions of these people already occurred, okay? And sometimes it's evident that he's a bit uneasy with this, because it's a bit like claiming is on shaky grounds, if you want, because it's like claiming that the magnificent Alexander's Gate doesn't hold water. Okay, because you could say, well, you built this incredible gate, but the Huns can still come. But and he acknowledged that one recent Hunnic invasion already happened. It's that of 521 by the Sabir Huns. But what is interesting for the author is that these invasions are only a very pale reflex of what will happen at the end of times. If this final eschatological invasion doesn't occur now, it is because Alexander's Gate is there, okay? Yeah, maybe some Huns can still make their way through it, but there is still this eschatological portal, which will be removed by God. Only God will remove the gate, and then the final the eschatological process will begin.
And that goes on to the background behind the Quranic pericope of the القرنين, chapter 18, verses 83 to 102. The first thing that I would like to ask about that is, where did you get the name, or where did you get the idea of using the term pericope from? Because it was the first time I've ever heard of it. And I actually liked using it, and I use it a few times in my notes, and even what I plan to be the title of this discussion. So what inspired you to use that word? I know this might be kind of like a small point, but it's something that I'm a bit curious about.
I think that the first, because using pericope in this context, referring to a Quranic passage, I think is using a terminology that belongs mostly to biblical studies. Okay. And I think that the first time I heard and I then taken this use was by my colleague Guillaume D, who first spoke about the Dhul-Qarnayn pericope, and I found that this is an accurate definition.
Okay, so according to Muslim sources, in what year was the Quranic pericope of Dhul-Qarnayn revealed? I know they might have a, well, I'll just let you go on and explain that.
Okay, so according to the Islamic tradition, the Surah Al-Kahf is a Meccan surah. Of course, must have been composed sometimes before the date of Muhammad's migration to Yathrib, Medina. So, and this is why I think recent scholarship on the relationship between the Quran and the Nesana attracted so much attention, because if one accepts the working hypothesis that the Nesana was composed after 629, and if one accepts that this Syriac work inspired the Quranic passage, then we would have some serious consequences for the chronology of the Quran. A chronology that I should mention is not in the Quran itself, okay? The chronology has been established by the Muslim tradition or by Western scholars. Now, it's a very controversial issue. There have been some good progresses in trying to determine a stylistic development in the Quran and try to establish some kind of chronology. I only partially agree with this because if it's true that in certain cases you can identify some kind of trend in the evolution of the style. There is a very problematic assumption. There are two problematic steps. First of all, that even if there is a chronological development, we could still not relate with confidence the layers to a specific historical context. So it's even if we accept a distinction between different portions of the Quran and we place them on a chronological development scale, there is no reason to assume that this was composed in Mecca, Medina, Rome, or New York. I mean, it's just to say that we really, it's very problematic to find a point, linking point to the historical reality. And then there is another very problematic aspect, that of the single authorship of the text, because of course, establishing a chronology through stylistic development implies that there is a single author, but this is not self-evident to me. So anyway, I think this is, anyway, these complications are not entirely problematic for me. They are, but it really depends on what we want to do with the relationship between the Quran and the Nesana. As I mentioned, my recent analysis suggests that the Nesana was not composed after 629. It was already composed in the middle of the 6th century. So in this case, the chronological factor might not be that problematic, although my preliminary investigation, and I might still change my mind, but the preliminary investigation I've done suggests that the Quranic pericope most strictly adheres to the 7th century version of the Nesana than to what we can reconstruct of the original version. It's a very complicated philological analysis. It requires the reconstruction of what the original version might have looked like. There are, in the Nesana, as it has been transmitted to us, it is evident that some passages have been erased, and that this cut, this erasement is reflected in the narratological structure in the Quran. So the key there becomes to understand if these passages had already been removed by the original author in the 6th century, or if they were removed by the 7th century redactor. But at this stage, I don't really have an answer, a definitive answer, because I still haven't investigated the question to emit a final judgment.
And what are your thoughts on reasons for revealing the Quranic pericope of the Qarnayn, or as Muslim tradition calls it, Asbab an-Nuzul? How much credence does that factor into your research or work, or being that it's of a tradition, kind of can't really substantiate it with much, does it not factor into your research?
I mean, not really. I would say that that's a separate research, because the Asbab an-Nuzul, about the revelation of the Dhul-Qarnayn pericope, are obviously not reliable. It's something that doesn't preserve any historical memory. It's evident that it's pure speculation on the text. And it is very evident, for instance, when we read that, because the pericope is introduced by the standard formula, وَيَسْأَلُونَ on, and so they ask you about, and this is a formula that we find elsewhere in the Quran. And when commentators read this formula, the follow-up question was, okay, who is asking you about this القرنين, and the answer they provide is that it's the Jews in Medina. In Mecca, no, in Mecca. I think I don't know if I recall it correctly, but I think it's a delegation of Jews coming from Medina to Mecca. Now, the problem with this is that when you read the Surah Al-Kahf, it's evident that the background is a Christian background, because we are facing narratives that were spread only among Christians. You have the story of the sleepers in the cave, which is an adaptation of the story of the sleepers, the 7 sleepers of Ephesus, which is a Christian story.
Also in Syriac, the Christian liturgical language.
Yeah, okay. Absolutely. And then you have also the story of Moses and the servant of God. This is another Alexander legend readapted, but it is combined with another legend that the second part of that pericope, with the famous story of Moses following.
Yep. And we're actually going to talk about that, probably the last part of this towards the end of this interview, because that is something that totally blew my mind. And a lot of people wrestle with that part of chapter 18 as well, the story of Moses and Kidder. You know, you really can't take it as history, but you know, as a historical fact, it might have been, might not have been, who knows, but you could have just seeing how it just comparing it with what you might find in the Syriac legend of Alexander and other traditions with that just totally blew my mind. And that maybe it might have been a play on Alexander, the legend of Alexander, but kind of just switched the characters around a bit.
Well, it's a very complicated relationship between these two stories. But first, we should say that the second part, the final part of that Moses story about the travel of Moses with the servant that he meets at the Majma al-Bahrain, it has nothing to do with the Alexander legends. It's some kind of new narrative tradition mixed with the Alexander tradition. However, this story has a very close parallel in the work of a Christian writer called John Moskos. Okay, and there we read about a hermit meeting an angel, with the hermit performing the deeds of Moses, and the angels the deeds of the servant of God. So it's again a Christian narrative, and then that of the القرنين reflects the Alexander legend spread among Christians. So if you read the Surah, it's entirely a Christian. It has entirely Christian background. So Asbab an-Nuzul connected this to Jewish traditions are not reliable. As for what you were saying, the Moses pericope, that's fascinating. It requires a lot of investigation. The first 5 verses are surely inspired by the story of Moses, by the story of Alexander. It's evident it's a very peculiar and unique narrative motif about the resurrection of a fish. You find this in the Alexander traditions. It's not unusual that legends or stories, tales, call them however you want, attributed to a character, are used in relation to another character.
And we don't have much left. Just thank you for your time, and I hope it hasn't been, you know, too much of it's too difficult to get through my line of questioning. Hopefully I wasn't asking any kind of elementary school questioning or questions. But I am curious. The majority of classical Muslim scholars believe the القرنين to be Alexander. This is a fact, nobody can deny it. But did they have any knowledge of the Nisana? I mean, do you know how early Muslim scholars arrived at associating القرنين with Alexander? And does the Nisana have anything to do with shaping that conclusion on their part?
Okay, so this is an excellent question, and this is an area that requires so much investigation because, for instance, I have no doubt that Zulkarnain is Alexander, but not the historical Alexander. Zulkarnain is a reflex of the Alexander of the Nessana. That is an Alexander who is a prophet, an Alexander who has horns provided by God. Okay. So first, commentators, as far as I could see, had really no doubts in identifying Zulkarnain with Alexander. Okay, doubts emerged later in very complex circumstances. We have different factors that brought to a separation between Zulkarnain and Alexander. As for the knowledge and the reception of the Nessana in the post-Islamic period or post-Quranic period, to use a better term of chronological reference for us, Kevin Van Bladel has pointed out some elements of the Nessana used by some Arab historians. And we know that the Nessana, a version of the Nessana, was translated into Arabic. It's fascinating because it's not really a translation. It's an Arabic story of Alexander that ostensibly draws from the Nessana, but also from the Quranic passage. And then these stories later re-emerge in Ethiopic versions of the stories of Alexander that were translated through Arabic intermediaries.
Okay, so that's how the Ethiopian version made it to that region. It was translated from the Syriac. It wasn't like it existed before the Syriac, but that's where it had got it from.
Well, for sure, this is really not within my area of research because I explored mostly the phenomenon in late antiquity, and I didn't really follow Alexander in later periods. But as far as I know, Syriac sources about Alexander, including the Nessana, provided substantial materials for Arabic stories about Alexander, and these Arabic stories were translated into Ge'ez.
Okay, and this is there's a few people I would like to touch on. Budge, I'm just using his last name, Noldika, and as you mentioned already, Van Bladel. These three men made significant contributions to understanding the Dul-Qarnayn, the Quranic pericope of Dul-Qarnayn, Budge being the one to translate the Syriac legend of Alexander. Then a year later, in 1890, Noldika discovers correspondence between the Nessana and the Quranic pericope. And as you mentioned in your article, his theory lay dormant for quite some time until it reaches Kevin Van Bladel in the late 2010s, I think 2007 or 2008, something like that. And that's when you see a reemergence of the theory of Noldika. But previous, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I would say that absolutely. I mean, Noldeke already pointed out the textual link between the Dul-Qarnayn pericope and the Nessana, and incredibly, this was completely neglected for several decades. It was only recently that Kevin Van Bladel reassumed this theory, and he wrote a very strong article in support, although I think it must be reanalyzed at the light of what I could find about the Nessana. Now, there is also another thing that should be added to that discussion. I started to introduce these elements in that old article that I published in 2013, and I hope that I will write more in the future. There are few myths to dismantle. Because Van Bladel's article found some pushbacks recently, which are not completely fair and are not completely well structured. So we need, first of all, to point out that the relationship between the Dhul-Qarnayn pericope and the Nesana is not only a superficial reference to a common theme. Okay, the two texts share much more than that.
And that you're going on to my next question. So this is perfect.
Okay, so first of all, the Dhul-Qarnayn pericope reflects the way the Syriac author has combined together previous traditions. It's true that individually these traditions pre-existed, but the way in which they are combined together is certified for the first time in the Nesana. The Syriac author, let's say, took A, B, C that were around there, and he put them in this specific order. And if you want, he did A, B, C, E, and A, B, C, E, G, because he excluded some traditions. So not only did he put together traditions that were not connected to one another, he also excluded some episodes. It's a huge editorial work, if you want, and this editorial work is reflected in the Quran. So it's not only a superficial general reference, like, I don't know, the story of the references to Jesus, that you can say, yes, but this story is about Jesus were everywhere in late antiquity. There we have a real textual network in the way the traditions are put together. And even if we focus on the specific element of Alexander's Gate, which is the one that always catch the eye, nobody spends too much time looking at the structure of the general pericope. It's only about the Alexander's Gate. A pushback that I often heard is that, yeah, but these traditions about Alexander's Gate must have been very popular. And the answer is no. I mean, we know that there were traditions about Alexander building iron gates. We don't have any proof that there were traditions about Alexander building an eschatological gate, and a horned Alexander building an eschatological gate made of iron and bronze.
So this is unique to the Syriac version.
This is unique to the Syriac. There is a very specific reason why in the Syriac work it is that way, because this reflects the ideology of the author, and this is reflected in the Quran, saying that the Dhul-Qarnayn pericope is referring to very ancient and very known traditions about Alexander that were exceedingly common, as the same valued and saying blah, blah, blah. So it's really, it has no proof, no certification. So there is, if one is in good faith, cannot deny the relationship between the two texts.
And I did want to touch on, so basically you're saying that the similarities, the literary similarities are too strong to say that maybe the Quran drew this from a pre-existing tradition outside of the Nesana. And similarly, the philological similarities are way too strong to say that it possibly got it from a common source with the Nesana.
I mean, you know, for instance, there are some recently published academic works that try to separate the two texts, pointing out some textual instances where there is not an extremely close connection. The problem is that these are really marginal details. I will give you an example,
Please.
saying that the Nesana and the Quran are not related, because in the Nesana, Alexander encounters some fetid water, poisonous water, whereas in the Quran, the Qarnayn finds some boiling water. And saying that there is a difference there, to me, sounds really like dragging the situation a bit too far from reality, because overall the correspondences are so strict. We need to clarify what situation we're talking about. So if by saying that the Nesana is the source of the Quran, we imagine a situation in which there is an author sitting at the desk with the Nesana at his left and the Syriac-Arabic dictionary at his right, and translating the Syriac into Arabic. We can say, no, it didn't go that way, okay? If we want to imagine that this Syriac text gave rise to some new literary trends about Alexander, and that that the Quranic pericope participates into this small Alexander Renaissance, or this small literary revolution, we are closer to the reality. And it's extremely interesting. Again, I'm at a very early stage of my investigation of this question, but in the Quran, we find some kind of elements that are not found in the Nesana, but that are found in sources inspired by the Nesana. For instance,
Mimra, or the Syriac homily.
Pseudo-Ephraim and Pseudo-Methodius in particular. I will give an example. When the Quran says that the Gog and Magog will raise like waves, okay? The verb the Quran use, I don't have the text under my eyes. I'm trying to remember. I think it's, I don't remember, but
I'm trying to remember too. I think Van Bladel had it in his article.
Yes, but what I think that Kevin related the verb to a prophecy about Jesus in Luke, and I don't think that this is the case, because in the Quran that specific verb is used to describe the waves in the story of Noah's Ark. And the image of the waves in Noah's time and the deluge is used to describe the Gog and Magog arrival in the Pseudo-Ephraim. So again, we have a Syriac text that becomes somehow influential, and the Nesana is part of this literary universe influenced by this text. But it's not a translation from Syriac into Arabic. It's an adaptation, if you want.
Okay. And just my last two set of questions. The re-elaboration of previous and contemporary traditions. You touched on it a bit, but just to kind of unpack it a little bit more, there are elements from previous traditions present in the Syriac legend of Alexander, as you've already mentioned. And one of them that I found to be the most interesting, like as I already said, is the Mimra, or the Syriac metrical homily, the poem. And it's the and in that you have the episode of the quest for the water of life. And in the Quranic pericope of Moses and Al-Khidr, you see something that is akin to the quest for the water of life mentioned in the, it's not in the Syriac legend of Alexander, correct, but it's in the Mimra. Yes. So that just leads me to, I mean, like, how do the Quranic pericope share this with the Mimra, when the Mimra came in, was possibly created in 635? You mentioned that there might have been, in your article, and I know you said it's outdated and you don't kind of hold to this hypothesis anymore, but possibly a vorlage, that the way that you had it constructed was there was a vorlage text, there was the Syriac legend of Alexander, and then there was the Mimra, and that the Quran possibly took from the the Syriac legend, but in this hypothesis, you didn't have the Mimra linking to the Quran. So I was just wondering how did that association come about?
Okay, so it's very complicated relationship. Well, first of all, talking about that article, what in that article I had named the hypothetical vorlage. Now I would name the original Nessana, because now I know that there was a Nessana before the Nessana, so a 6th century Nessana. Now, we need to clarify a few things to point out how complicated the situation is. It's true that there is a story of the water of life in the Quranic pericope immediately preceding the Dhul-Qarnain's one, and it's true that there is a water of life story in the Mimra, the metrical omni. However, when you compare them to one another, you realize that these are two different versions of the same story, and that the version in the Quran is not, cannot, if you want, be derived from the one in the Mimra, because the version in the Quran is much more similar to the oldest one that we find in the Alexander Romans. Okay. Just to enter into the details, in the Alexander Romans, Alexander asks his cook to prepare a meal. The cook washes a fish into a water course, the fish comes back to life, and this is the water of life. It's something that happens by accident. And in the Quran is the same. Moses asked the valet to cook something, the fish escapes, and so it's the very same dynamic. In the Mimra, it's completely different. It's an intentional quest. Alexander orders his cook to make a test. Take a dried fish and you wash it in every water course that you find, because I want to find the water of life. So these are two different versions of the story, and the Syriac version is different from the one that we find in the Quran. So it's a very complicated textual network, which I'm trying to figure out in this moment. What is sorry?
No, go ahead.
What is important is that I have reason to believe that the original Nessana included a version of the story of life, but it was removed. And then the issue is to understand if the presence of this story in the Mimra is because the Mimra preserves a more original version of what the structure, the textual structure looked like, or if it was reintroduced, and this has some considerable consequences to understand the structure of the Surat al-Kahf. But again, I am still early stage of the investigation.
Okay, but it seems like at this point, all things considered, you really it's not enough similarities to really say that the Quranic pericope of Moses and Al-Khidr took from the Mimra, being the nature. Okay, and this is my last. No,
I would exclude it.
Okay,
what
and
it tells
this is my last question.
However, sorry, this is something that I want to add. What it tells us is that the author or the authors of that Quranic surah were aware that the two stories of the water of life and of Alexander's wall or gate were somehow related to one another, or at least that another author, a Syriac author, perceived these two stories the same way, as something that must be put together in the same text.
Okay, and this is my last question. What are your thoughts on, or what are your thoughts for those, or to those, what do you have to say about people who believe Dhul-Qarnain is Cyrus the Great, not Alexander? What do you believe there's any credence to that? I mean, is that on shaky ground, or is it on no ground? just from your perspective as a scholar who's researched the subject for the last 15 to 12 years, what are your thoughts on that assertion?
Well, first of all, one thing that we need to clarify is that, at least from my perspective, here we are not talking about historical figures. We are talking about, if you want, fictional characters that, of course, originate in history, but already the Alexander of the Messana is not the historical Alexander. Now, it is my conviction that Dhul-Qarnayn in the Quran is a character that reflects the Syriac Alexander in the Messana. At the same time, the Syriac Alexander in the Messana somehow incorporates traits that other traditions attribute to Cyrus, if you want. But if you read about the Dhul-Qarnayn is, I have this. It's more a hobby for me to read